Tonight on First at 9 this Saturday the 26th of July 2025. Recalibration. IMF closely engaging with authorities involved in the underreporting of expenses, says the IMF mission chief for Sri Lanka.
We engaged with the authorities to a great length, clearly and openly, and we reached agreement on understanding the circumstances under which this data underreporting took place.
Further notes that the IMF is closely monitoring Sri Lanka's tariff negotiations with the US.
We understand that the authorities are in negotiation with US authorities over the reciprocal tariff, so we paying very close attention to this development.
Walking blind. No national education policy for Sri Lanka, reveals the Education Ministry. Changing course. Education reforms to be implemented in 2026 for grades 1 to 6, reveals the Prime Minister. Says history and aesthetics to be slotted in the syllabus as electives. The outrage machine. Opposition rebuffs the government's attempt to delist history and aesthetics of mandatory status.
From Derana, this is Derana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to Derana First at 9. I'm Aditya Drisingha joining you live with the latest in Sri Lanka and around the world. Brought to you by the only Sri Lankan media network to rise to the pinnacle across all media platforms, recognized as the best by every survey and beloved by the people. Now, in your top story tonight, IMF mission chief for Sri Lanka, Ivan Papageorgiou, reveals that the IMF is openly engaging with the local authorities involved in the underreporting of central government expenses, and went on to further clarify that the top International Monetary Authority is considering the circumstances under which the underreporting by authorities took place. Joining an exclusive interview on Derana's at Hyde Park with Indiva Riamuwata yesterday, the IMF mission chief for Sri Lanka asserts that corrective actions will be put in practice to mitigate such instances in the future. He also highlights that the IMF is closely monitoring Sri Lanka's ongoing negotiations with the United States on reciprocal tariffs.
We'd like to ask you the key reforms that led to the approval of the fourth IMF review, and given the earlier reporting breach that was spoken of, what prompted the board's confidence to proceed with the review, and what safeguards are now in place to ensure transparency by Sri Lankan authorities going forward?
In order to complete any review, the IMF Executive Board has to be assured and has to be certain that a member country under a program arrangement is on track with its stated objectives under a program. And like any program review, this one did exactly that. There were 2 board meetings took place and went a long way in reassuring the board and ensuring the continuation of the program. On July 1st of this year, the IMF Executive Board reviewed the program material and performance from our previous visit in April. They reviewed the progress that Sri Lanka has made, and alongside of that, a set of performance criteria, structural benchmarks and indicative targets. Some examples of these structural benchmarks include the enactment of the asset recovery law, the reinstatement of parate executions, the publication of the VAT capital compliance improvement plan, and additional ones. There were also 2 prior actions that were taken into consideration, both relating to electricity. The first was on restoring electricity cost recovery, and the second one was on ensuring that the automatic tariff adjustment mechanism based on the bulk supply transaction account was reinstated and it's working going ahead. This is something that we will continue discussing with the authorities based on this discussion. You mentioned obviously the inadvertent underreporting of some data. The executive board of the IMF considered evidence and a report from the managing director of the IMF laying out the parameters and the circumstances upon which that underreporting took place. That reporting was related to the stock of central government expenditure arrears,
right.
And the board took into consideration the circumstances under which it happened, the authorities' explanations, and the subsequent corrective actions that were associated with that. We engaged with the authorities to a great length, clearly and openly, and we reached agreement on understanding the circumstances under which this data underreporting took place, and we have assurances that there are corrective actions in place, which include proper reporting and proper commitment control in preventing similar arrears from taking place in the future, as well as clearing these arrears within a period of 2 years.
And the IMF is satisfied with the kind of commitments given by the Sri Lankan side.
Yes, we are.
Has the IMF been kept in the loop or informed about Sri Lanka's trade negotiations with the United States in terms of the reciprocal tariffs imposed?
We understand that the authorities are in negotiation with US authorities over the reciprocal tariffs and the trade agreement. Obviously, as you know, on April 2nd, the level of reciprocal tariffs for Sri Lanka was set at 44%, and then on July 9th, that level was set at 30%. Obviously, this level of tariffs will take place from the current 10% of the base tariff to 30% on August 1st, and we look forward to seeing any eventual outcome of the negotiations. So we're paying very close attention to these developments.
Now, former President Ranil Wickremesinghe, reflecting on the prevailing global trade tensions, questioned whether the Indian Ocean region might soon find itself drawn into emerging trade alliances and economic blocs. Speaking at the same event, Australian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka Paul Stevens reaffirms Australia's dedication to playing a leading role in the Indian Ocean region. He outlined plans to collaborate closely with neighbouring nations to foster a stable, peaceful and rules-based regional order.
Theme Geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, an event organized by the geopolitical cartographer, was held recently in Colombo. The event, followed by a roundtable discussion, saw the attendance of a number of Sri Lankan diplomats as well as other dignitaries.
At the same time, the Indian Ocean region is growing in economic and strategic importance, and in fact from the 2030s on we think that the states of the Indian Ocean littoral, which extends from East Africa through South Asia to Indonesia, will become the new drivers of global growth. And of course India is leading the way as the world's fastest growing large economy and trending to be the world's most populous country in the next few years. We are committed to playing a leading role in managing the opportunities and challenges in the region over the coming decades, and Australia has a self-evident interest in the Indian Ocean. We want to work our Indian Ocean neighbours to shape a region that is peaceful and predictable, where countries can cooperate, trade and thrive, where internationally agreed rules and norms prevail, and where no country needs to feel like it is a hostage to circumstance. We definitely support Sri Lanka's accession bid to RCEP, not just for the market access gains and the potential economic growth that would open up, but also it would bind Sri Lanka more closely to important markets in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Australia thinks that in the Indian Ocean region we should double down on IORA and work to turn it into a regional mechanism that provides and enhances peace and security.
We are again becoming the most important region in the world. Climate change, environment and the minerals is going to be very important and play an important role. Now what do we have here? We have the whole Sino-American rivalry into the Indian Ocean. On the other hand, there is also a new factor which has come in the last 2 months. The question of Israel coming in and the bombing of Iran. These are the ones that will decide what the future is going to be both here and of the world. Within the Indo-Pacific, what is not clear, what is the role of the IOPZ? Secondly, the BRI. Whether you like it or not, the BRI seems to be here to stay. And many countries are members of the BRI. Now, we are all committed to UNCLOS and to the fact that freedom of navigation. Is this going to change? Is the sea going to be a part of a conflict if it takes place between the different rival powers? So these are some of the issues that we have. A new issue that has come up, the Israel's bombing of the Iran. You have come into the Indian Ocean area, but the IORA nations have not been consulted. You get on to the question of sovereignty and security. The smaller states are getting hedged in. Take the example of Sri Lanka. We identified as the country that sold out Hambantota Harbour to the Chinese. Why is that? And we are the only Asian country that took part in Operation Prosperity Guardian. Others were frightened. We just said go and take part in it. It's a matter of principle. So how do you manage it? How do we survive? We have what we call the balancing act. If you feel our security is under threat in their country, then everyone gets together to see how the balancing act is done. But I think it's much better if you sit down at the table and discuss this. Trade. Indian Ocean has to decide whether we are going in for trade pacts or not. Especially with the reciprocal tariffs, we can see that US market is very close to us. On the other hand, tariff is not a good word as far as we are concerned. So what do we do? As far as East Asia is concerned, you've got RCEP, you've got the comprehensive and the progressive TPP, you've got ASEAN. And there's of course BRI. Indian Ocean countries have been moving away. The Gulf Cooperation countries have very low tariffs, so there's no issue with them. But what do we do rest of the, we have to decide. Are we going to become a trading bloc, or are we going to individually join RCEP, ASEAN and the others? These are the issues that we have.
Crunchy goodness for hunger on the go.
Yadia, ලොව වැඩියෙන්ම අලෙවි electric scooter Avance Auto වෙතින්.
Adding on to concerns riling up over Sri Lanka's education sector, officials attached to the Ministry of Education revealed that the country has no national education policy in place at the moment. At the Committee on Public Accounts hearing, officials further revealed that all the recommendations were submitted from time to time concerning the national education policy. No such recommendations were ever approved.
දෙමළ ඒකම්තුමා අපට පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් කරන්න පුළුවන්ද අපේ රටේ අධ්‍යාපන ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් තියෙනවද? ජාතික අධ්‍යාපන ප්‍රතිපත්තිය.
Abiding by the established protocol, the national policy on education must be presented to the President. Accordingly, in 2022, the National Education Commission presented the national policy on education to the then President. However, the presented national policy was not awarded the final approval. I am not aware why the final approval was not granted. When the incumbent Prime Minister appointed the National Education Commission, the first task handed to them was to review the 2022 National Education Policy and to draft a new one.
අපේ රටට ජාතික අධ්‍යාපන ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් මේ වනතෙක් නැහැ කියලා.
The Education Commission was set up to submit recommendations on education policy to the President and the Cabinet. So what has been submitted from time to time are recommendations.
විටින් විට දීලා තියෙනවා.
අපේ පැත්තෙන් ප්‍රතිපත්ති ගණනාව සකස් කරලා දීලා තියෙනවා. හැබැයි කවදාවත් ඒක ජනාධිපතිතුමා විසින් ඉදිරිපත් කළා අනුමත වෙලා නැති ප්‍රශ්නයක් තමයි තියෙන්නේ.
This issue was also discussed back in 2023. For instance, a certain school was shut down on the 25th of February 2005 without the approval of the School Structure Committee. According to the Act, the Western Provincial Council does not have the legal authority to lease land owned by the Ministry of Education. However, according to a decision taken by the Provincial Cabinet, the Western Provincial Council decided to lease 40 purchases of land and a building belonging to the Ministry of Education for a period of 2 years starting on November 1st, 2018 without proper legal oversight to set up an ancient puppet art institute. Despite the lease period having ended, no action has been taken to repossess the property. As a result, a plot of land with high commercial value was illegally possessed by a squatter. The school in question was damaged by the tsunami in 2004. Consequently, it was shut down. Subsequently, the land was leased out pursuant to a decision taken by the Western Provincial Cabinet for 2 years. When the lessee did not vacate the land as contractually obligated, a case was filed with the Magistrates Court. Accordingly, the tenant was ordered to vacate the premises. The tenant, however, appealed to the High Court, which was dismissed. Subsequently, an appeal was filed with the Court of Appeal, which affirmed the High Court's decision. Now the matter is pending before the Supreme Court. We anticipate the Supreme Court to reaffirm the decision taken by the High Court.
මේක සරල කෙනෙකුට කරන්න බෑ. අපි දන්න විදියට සාමාන්‍ය පුරවැසියෙකුට කරන්න බෑ. අපිට දැනෙන එක තමයි මේක පිටිපස්සේ කුමන හෝ දේශපාලන හස්තයක් තියෙන්න ඕන.
භූමියට අයිතිවාසිකම් කියන පුජ්‍යලයා කවුද?
නඩු දාලා තියෙන්නේ සරත් අබේ ගුණවර්ධන කියලා කෙනෙක්.
අබේ ගුණවර්ධන කියලා කෙනෙක්?
සරත් අබේ ගුණවර්ධනනේ.
ඔව් පෞරාණික රූකඩ කෞතුකාගාරයක් පවත්වාගෙන යනවා. ඒකට මේ අවුරුදු 2ක අනුමැතියකින් තමයි එතනට ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ. ඊට පස්සේ දේපල බාර දීලා නැහැ දිගටම රැඳී ඉන්නවා එතන.
පනත ප්‍රකාරව එහෙම බදු දෙන්න පුළුවන්ද?
පනත ප්‍රකාරව එහෙම දෙන්න බෑ.
ඒතර කවුද බදු කිසිම රස්සම් කළා තියෙන්නේ?
පළාත් අමාත්‍යංශ.
ඒකම්තුමාගේ අපි ඉල්ලීමක් කරනවා මේ ක්‍රියාවට අදාළ අල්ලසා දූෂණයකට අදාළව විමර්ශනයක් කරන්න කියලා.
ඒක නඩුවක් යන හින්දා ඒ නඩුව ඒක නඩු තීන්දුව ආවට පස්සේ අපිට ඒ වගේ දෙයක් කරන්න පුළුවන්.
අල්ලස් එකට දෙන්න බැරිද පළාත් කැබිනට් එක ගතපු තීන්දුව සම්බන්ධයෙන් ප්‍රශ්න කරන්න?
පුළුවන්.
අපි එහෙම එකට යමු.
එහෙම පුළුවන්.
එතකොට නඩුව යන්නේ භුක්තිය සම්බන්ධයෙන්.
භුක්තිය සම්බන්ධයෙන් තමයි. එයා ඉල්ලනවා එයා මුල් අයිතිකරු කියලා.
වසර දෙකකට බදු දීමක් කරා කියලා තියෙනවනේ. ඔව්. වසර දෙකකට බදු දීම දීලා තිබුණේ ওই නඩු කියන පුද්ගලයාටමයි කියලා කිව්වනේ නේද? ඔව්. එතකොට එහෙනම් එයා ඔප්පුවක් පෙන්නනවා නම් එයා ඇයි ඒ වෙලාවේ අවුරුදු දෙකකට බදු ගත්තේ?
ඒක තමයි ප්‍රශ්නේ.
එම්නම් සභාපතිතුමනි මේ සභාපතිතුමාගේ යෝජනාව ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න පුළුවන්.
Now, on the topic of education, Prime Minister Dr. Harini Amarasuriya states that now is the time to implement the new education reforms, which according to the Premier cannot be delayed any further. Speaking at an awareness program on the new educational reforms held in Ratnapura today, she further states that the necessary infrastructure for the reforms will be provided gradually.
A discussion to raise awareness regarding the new educational reforms and education development was held today at the auditorium of the Ratnapura District Secretariat under the patronage of Prime Minister Dr. Harini Amarasuriya.
Under the primary education reforms, a collection of activity manuals will be provided for students. Accordingly, we have compiled these manuals for grade 1 for the next year. Meanwhile, the National Institute of Education has commenced training programs for teachers. At the GCE ordinary level, students will sit for 7 subjects, with 5 subjects being mandatory. Among them, students will have the opportunity to choose 2 subjects. There will be 9 elective subjects. History and aesthetics, which have become a hot topic, are also among these elective subjects.
මේ අතරට අපේ වත්මන් කතාබහට ලක් වෙලා තියෙන සංවාදයට ලක් වෙලා තියෙන සෞන්දර්ය සහ ඉතිහාසයක් තිබෙනවා.
එතකොට මෙතනදී ළමයි කිසියම් ආකාරයකදී අසමත් වෙනවද? සියලු ළමයි සමත් වෙනවද? දැනට සඳහන් කරන්න.
What I can tell you now is that no student will fail. Their result will not affect their advanced level education.
අධ්‍යාපන කටයුතු සඳහා
ගුරුහිගයක් තියෙනවා. ඒ අදාළ විෂය ගුරුවරු නෙමෙයි ඉන්නේ. එතකොට මේ අභියෝග කොහොමද අපි සම්පූර්ණ කරන්නේ?
2026 අපි මේක ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්නේ.
We will be implementing these reforms in 2026, starting from grade 1 through grade 6. The necessary infrastructure and human resources for this section have become our primary target, and we are working hard to complete them. We have already started teacher training programs for this section. The Ministry of Education and the National Institute of Education believe that we need to prepare 100,000 teachers for this task. The decisive change will come in grade 10, and we have a period of 3 years to prepare for this. We have begun increasing facilities at education colleges this year. As the ministry, we are currently holding discussions on changes to the recruitment procedure. The decisive factor here is the teacher. Since there have been no reforms in this area previously, we cannot afford to delay them any longer. Based on where we are now, these reforms must be implemented. As we are all bound by policy issues, this is the appropriate time for implementation.
Now, the dilemma on whether or not history and aesthetics must be recognized as electives continue to dominate political discourse. Former Minister Dr. Vijayadasa Rajapaksa claims that there is no room for reforms outside the general consensus, while former Minister Padli Champika Ranawaka claims that the Dissanayaka government is attempting to blunt the instrument of education imperative in shaping the complete citizen.
The incumbent government, which opposed all reforms we proposed, now seems to be embracing the same reforms. They also seem to be claiming credit for the reforms. We have no problem. Our question is simple. Have you made history and aesthetics compulsory subjects? The general public is concerned over a possible attempt at removing history and aesthetics off the school syllabus. Specifically, the Buddhist clergy seems to be extremely concerned. There is no room for reforms that breach the general consensus. Firstly, there must be a broader discourse on these proposed reforms within the education sector. The government must never be allowed to impose reforms to education dogmatically. At the moment, it is apparent that the wind has been blown off the government's sails by these reforms. However, these reforms were initially proposed long ago.
ක්‍රියාවලියක ප්‍රතිඵලයක් හැටියට තමයි අපි දකින්නේ.
විෂයන් 9 වෙනුවට 14ක් කරාම
The president never elaborated how the weight of the school bag would decrease when subjects are increased from 9 to 14. Then the president went on to speak about robots. The president said that art, literature and history would be categorized into a different basket and mixed with certain tech subjects. Those subjects are supposedly electives and not mandatory. Accordingly, the hypothesis is that students would choose the subjects they prefer considering the labor market demand. These suggestions shouldn't be surprising to anyone since the advisory committee that suggested these reforms primarily comprised business people. Some were racketeers. There were no educators in the committee. However, it is apparent that the Dissanayaka government will blunt the instrument of education which is imperative in shaping complete citizens.
සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම මොට කරන වැඩපිළිවෙලක් තමයි අනුර කුමාර දිසානායකගේ ආණ්ඩුවෙන් එල්ල වෙලා තියෙන්නේ.
Now, leader of the Sarvajana Balaya MP Dilip Javira claims that the incumbent government's drive to remove history of the school syllabus is fueled by the dark and grim history of the ruling party. While addressing a meeting today, the parliamentarian further accused the government of undermining the country's cultural identity.
The Sarvajana Sabha of the Beliatta Pradesh Sabha jurisdiction was set up today under the patronage of the leader of Sarvajana Balaya, parliamentarian Dilip Javira.
ඉතිහාසය ඕනනම් කරන්න කියලා විෂය නිර්දේශයට දානවා.
They are attempting to make history an elective. Who is behind this attempt? We initially thought that Prime Minister Dr. Harni Amarasuriya, who is not a product of free education, was behind this initiative. But no, our closest friends and allies since childhood are behind these efforts. How can they be allowed to remove history of the school syllabus backed by Prime Minister Dr. Harni Amarasuriya's official authority? Now the government says that it will not remove history. They say that students will be granted the opportunity to study history at an advanced level akin to a PhD program. These are ridiculous statements. What will happen if history remains a compulsory subject? If history is allowed to remain a mandatory subject, the president would be placed in a peculiar predicament. How will history be written? History will record that a certain individual, who used to be a monk in the past, bombed the temple of the sacred tooth relic and was later elected to parliament. Despite the candor or lack thereof in those allegations, history will never be in favor of the incumbent president who opposed the war and ridiculed the war victory. So it seems only fair that the president hates history. Their political history is marred by chapters written in blood and horror. Temples in the north and the east were given special security up until recently. The chief prelate of the Asirimale temple spoke to me recently. He told me that the last police officer deployed for security was transferred. This is the inherent political bias of the government. This political movement, which only corresponded to 3% in the past, never respected our indigenous civility.
අපේ සભ්‍යත්වයට ගරු කරේ නැහැ.
Apico Next Gen. Make the leap to faster sleep.
හොඳම ෆෝන් එකක් ගන්න. ළඟම අපාන්ස් එකට යන්න.
Welcome back. Now, the death toll of the Thailand-Cambodia border dispute exceeded 30 today as fears grew that the Southeast Asian neighbors may become engulfed in an extended conflict. Several stakeholders and allied countries continue to push for a ceasefire negotiation, which thus far has not succeeded.
Fighting on the Thai-Cambodian border extended into a third day, and new flashpoints emerged today as both sides said they had acted in self-defense in the border dispute and called on the other to cease fighting and start negotiations. There were clashes earlier, both sides said, in the neighboring Thai coastal province of Trat and Cambodia's Phusat province, a new front more than 100 kilometers from other conflict points along the long contested border. More than 30 people have been killed and more than 130,000 people displaced in the worst fighting between the Southeast Asian neighbors in 13 years. As of today, Thailand said 7 soldiers and 13 civilians had been killed in the clashes, while in Cambodia, 5 soldiers and 8 civilians had been killed. Meanwhile, yesterday, the Cambodian ambassador to the United Nations, Chia Kyo, called for an immediate ceasefire with Thailand and for a peaceful solution of the dispute, following a closed meeting of the Security Council attended by Cambodia and Thailand. In the meantime, chair of the ASEAN Regional Bloc, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, also said he would continue to push a ceasefire proposal. Cambodia has backed Anwar's plan, while Thailand has said it agreed with it in principle. Meanwhile, releasing a statement to the media, Sri Lanka's Ministry of Foreign Affairs urged Thailand and Cambodia to engage in early diplomatic dialogue aimed at resolving differences peacefully, asserting that the Sri Lankan government is concerned over the recent incidents along the Cambodia-Thailand border.
Leader of the opposition, Sajith Premadasa, claims that the current government is politicizing the country's youth service infrastructure. Speaking at a discussion recently, Premadasa vowed to take all democratic measures possible against such efforts.
A group of individuals affiliated to youth societies met opposition leader Sajith Premadasa and discussed several issues of particular concern. The meeting was organised as part of the Citizens' Voice initiative.
The youth service infrastructure of the past was one which saw no racial, class, caste or political distinction. It existed exclusively to empower the youth. The incumbent government, along with the Minister of Youth Affairs and the President of the Youth Services Council, however, have completely politicized it. Youth services were set up in the past by a team including the Grama Ninadari and the Youth Services Officer only after informing all relevant residents of the new club. However, the same clubs today are set up by political authorities led by the JVP and the NPP local government councillors. They shortlist candidates for various positions within youth clubs unilaterally. They then expand these efforts to incorporate regional councils, district councils and national conferences. Youth service initiatives which were conducted transparently in the past have turned into an extremely partisan endeavour in favour of the JVP. We will take all possible democratic actions against these efforts.
Welcome back. Now in some international business news, South Korea is set to prepare a trade package that is mutually agreeable with the United States ahead of minister-level meetings planned next week and a US tariff pause deadline on the 1st of August. The package will include shipbuilding cooperation in sector of high interest to US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who discussed the matter with South Korea's Industry Minister Kim Yong-won yesterday. South Korea's trade negotiations with the US have included non-tariff barriers in the agriculture and digital service sectors, but foreign exchange has not been part of trade talks beyond usual consultations. South Korea's Finance Minister Koo Yoon-chul and Foreign Minister Cho Hyun will also hold meetings with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and State Secretary Marco Rubio, respectively, next week. Now in your business news, in a collaborative move, the Global Reporting Initiative South Asia, the Sustainable Development Council of Sri Lanka, the Export Development Board and the Joint Apparel Association Forum launched an Improving Transparency for Sustainable Business program in Sri Lanka.
According to the Joint Apparel Association Forum, the Improving Transparency for Sustainable Business program is set to enhance the global standing of Sri Lanka's apparel sector by embedding global best practices in ESG reporting. Senior Manager at GRI South Asia, Rahul Singh, asserted that the ITSB program is designed to elevate sustainability practices and transparency across South Asia's textile and apparel sector, positioning it for long-term resilience, profitability and global leadership. The GRI senior manager went on to note that adopting the GRI standards, the most widely used sustainability standards in the world, not only elevate corporate transparency but also strengthens investor confidence, international positioning and regulatory preparedness, contributing to a more transparent and future-ready economy. The Joint Apparel Association Forum further said the program comes at a time when global buyers are increasingly prioritizing traceability and ethical sourcing, with emerging regulations such as the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive reshaping international trade. Jaff also pointed out that with apparel accounting for over 40% of Sri Lanka's total export revenue and employing over 350,000 people, the ITSB represents a strategic step towards building a future-ready industry that is not just competitive but consciously sustainable. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's apparel exports grew 5.2% in June 2025, with shipments to the US down 5.7% but EU up 23.1%. Exports to the UK also grew 20.4%. From January to June, exports went up 8.95%, with EU rising 16.7%, the US 4.1% and UK 6.4%. Other markets meanwhile depicted an 8.9% growth.
That's all the news we have for you tonight. Thank you. Have a great night.